Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce you to someone who needs no introduction. The former Director General of the WTO, as we all know, former EU Trade Commissioner. Perhaps you're not quite so aware of everything that Pascal Lamy has been doing since. President of the Paris Peace Forum, President Emeritus of the Jacques Delors Institute on Policy, and so many boards of directors that he sits in that I will not tell you everything, but it's in the app. Pascal, thank you very much. I hope that you've well digested lunch, and do come and take a working lunch, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to ask Pascal a few questions, and then we're going to go to the floor. You're very informed. I'm sure you've got some great questions for Pascal. And I think most probably I will start with that old chestnut of, is trade good or bad for the environment? In a few words.
Well, that's the question the three institutes, Jacques Delors, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, put to a crowd of 120 young students, which we gathered in Hungary on purpose to talk about vibrant European integration this summer. So, and the question was exactly that one. It was not how is trade, it was not is trade good. The answer was, is trade bad for the environment? So the answer was 40% yes, 37% no, and the rest don't know.
Sounds like Brexit, very close.
Well, sounds like a reasonably good sort of featuring of what people have in mind, it being understood that the sample was young people, sort of below 20, 25. And that would be my answer, because that's what they believe and that's what matters. Not my answer, but their answer.
So do you think that we've got to better integrate environment into trade so that we have open trade that works for people and the planet?
Well, I think the answer is definitely yes. Not that this connection was not there. It's been there for a long time. The WTO constitution clearly puts trade opening at the service of environmental stability. We've had a Trade and Environment Committee in the WTO for a long time. There are a number of specific trade provisions in many multilateral environmental agreements. Even the jurisprudence, although I know diplomats don't like this word, but it's a clear way to do it. Even the jurisprudence of the appellate body, if you compare it to the sort of first steps in the mid-90s and now, is very different. So the connection was there, has been there, but it's true that it's now entering. It was more a sort of connection for lawyers, connection for institutional interested people. It wasn't a real connection with politics. And the real connection with politics is now, in a majority, a negative one. That's the reality. Lots of people in this planet, and notably in the young generation, perceive trade as bad for the environment. Why would we transport bananas, if you can eat apples? And why do pens come from Japan and then a bit of that is on here? And so, I mean, you know that. So this is a political reality which we now have to cope with. We can argue, and it needs to be very seriously argued in economics, in technical terms, in measuring carbon footprint, and there's this notion, for instance, that producing local and consuming local is the right answer, whatever the product, is absurd. There are many areas where importing a lower carbon footprint makes a lot of sense. So it's very complex, but I think the reality is that whereas the sort of intellectual connections were there. The political connections remain to be done, which is why we've been working a lot, and we just discussed this paper which the Institut Jacques Delors, Paris and Brussels produced, and Berlin produced in July. We've been discussing it during work, which is why we now have to walk the talk.
And that paper, I have it in front of me, so we're doing a bit of publicity here. Time to green EU trade policy. Time, why now? Some people would say that it should have been done before. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been reporting since 1988. So it seems that it should have been done before. Would you agree to that at an EU level?
Again, it was somehow done before. If you look at how green are trade policies on this planet, and there are many countries who have a trade policy, I mean, the EU is probably the greenest one, which doesn't say it's okay, but it says it started. Now, why now? For a very simple reason, and which I will express very bluntly, because I don't have to report to anybody on what I say, at least on this sort of topic, because European elections have changed the European political landscape up there in the European Parliament, and that there's no way any further EU trade agreement will go through the European Parliament without seriously greening the EU trade policy. It's as simple as that. I'm not saying I like it or I dislike it. I'm just saying this is a political reality. And if one starts from the premise that given that world growth is projected to go around 3.5% on average for the next 20 years, and that the EU growth for same average, same 20 years is 1.5, this growth difference between what EU generates and what the world generates tells the EU, you have to keep opening trade. So this is a strategic necessity, not least for social reasons, because as you know, the European social model is rather costly, and it doesn't work with a 1% growth. So there is a strategic necessity for the EU to keep opening trade, and then there is a political necessity to do what is necessary to convince a majority of European parliamentarians with a rather strong green group now that opening trade does not work against the environment, i.e. moving the 40-37 majority I mentioned among the young people we quizzed in Hungary to the other way around, which is why we need majority in a parliament.
So the question, of course, is, but how? And in this paper, you say multilateral trade, environmental trade agreements, forget it. I mean, is that because we're in a world where multilateralism is under pressure, or is there another reason why you're saying forget that as a path to pursue?
We're not exactly saying forget that, but what we're saying is that you cannot rely on the multilateral rules-based trading system to address this question seriously for the years to come, not least, because we have a major player in the WTO, which is the US, who doesn't want to play that game. So assuming the US would remain where they were during the Obama administration on environment, which was a clear difference, even then it would probably be very difficult because of the capacity of trade diplomats, and I hope there are not too many in this room who will feel bruised, but they have a formidable capacity to procrastinate. So this needs, we cannot rely on it. Now, of course...
sorry, sir, you were going to say...
Of course, we have a silver bullet, which is not the multilateral trading system, which is carbon pricing. The simple reasoning that in a global market capitalist economy, whether we like it or not is another issue, if you properly price carbon, then capitalism, production systems, relative prices will adjust to a new shape of trade flows that fit with a change in the relative prices and with a carbon price at, let's say, 100 euro per ton, then the world economy will move green. That is absolutely convincing. And I think it's absolutely right, except that it's not now. We were just discussing during lunchtime the proportion of today's emissions which are under a existing or projected carbon pricing scheme. You got 29 European trading systems, emission trading systems on this planet, and you got 28 countries that have a, let's say, proper carbon pricing tax. This is 57 countries, and this covers 20% of greenhouse gases emission, not just CO2, by the way, but greenhouse gases. 20%. Let's assume with a big effort, we will move to 40% 5 years from now. When do we get to 100%? So, I mean, if we only rely on this, the planet will be dead before we have a proper global carbon pricing system. So we need second best solution. Not that this one should not be sort of in a first row, but we need other tools. And there is a whole toolbox, which in this paper we rapidly review, and which then we will detail in order to help the European Commission and European institutions to fill the big gap which we now have between green proclamations following the elections, Mrs. von der Leyen so-called Green Deal, and this notion that, we need a border carbon adjustment in the EU.
What do you think of that? Because that is something that has been proclaimed by the new von der Leyen Commission.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean,
is it feasible?
It's clearly been proclaimed. The question is whether the gap between proclamation and what they have ready in their drawers for legislation through the Council and the Parliament is not there. No. Border carbon adjustments are systems which, and I remember that because I worked on that when I was EU Trade Commissioner, and that was, centuries ago. Now, we worked on that at the time. The US Congress worked on that. Many countries worked on that. It's a fantastic idea, except that nobody has ever practiced it. So a fantastic idea during 20 years that has no incarnation must have a problem. Now, of course, there are serious problems in the technicalities of that. And the easy ways out, if we look at the market of ideas, are one, a few sectoral examples, notably in the EU, because, as you may know, in the European Union, the emission trading scheme is not that strong. It's focused on a few areas, including energy production. So this is an area where the notion that because of carbon leakage, because of competitiveness, a border adjustment makes sense. So it's either sectoral, steel, cement, aluminium, or it's the sort of what specialists call the not-house solution, which is don't go the whole way of enormous problem of what's the metric of a carbon footprint, what if the carbon footprint of what you import is lower of your domestic production, blah, blah, blah. Then the other solution is have a club of countries that put a tariff across the board upon exports coming from countries that do not belong to the club. So, but that's an example of plenty of proclamation, plenty of papers, and the literature on border carbon adjustment is enormous.
What about expanding the club for the trading standards, shipping, For example, we had somebody from Maersk on the panel this morning, and they made some announcements about net zero emissions, but of course they're one of the biggest emitters. Do you think that they should be covered by this trading?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think they have to be covered. They have to, a way or another, pay the price for the carbon they emit. Same for the aviation sector. The problem, of course, is, as we know, again, this is a very simple concept, getting the politics to do that. And I think, and I carefully listened to what the representative of Maersk said this morning. I mean, the guy is way ahead of the average position of the shipping industry on this planet. Way ahead.
That would be the challenge, to get the alignment behind him.
I mean, what UK decided, which is that after 2025 they would not certify any non-carbon neutral new ship, is a good thing, except that this is about new ships. And you have to understand, and I was a Navy officer in a very long time ago, that the average age of a ship today is probably 35 years. So these things have a very long life. So these things need to go in this direction. It's inevitably piecemeal. So it's a bit of carbon pricing, it's a bit of regulation, and probably a big bit of regulation, by the way, which is where the EU has a major leverage because of the size of its internal market and the fact that if EU produces a solid regulation on whatever production and process method, this will contaminate a large part of the rest of the world, like we did it in other areas, or like we did it for chemicals with REACH, for instance.
So I was just going to say, I was wanting to give some time to the audience. Just moving on to the WTO, because there's been an environmental goods agreement, which I think wants to incentivize with lower tariffs, green goods and higher tariffs for non-sustainable goods. I'm putting it in my language, so I'm sure it's much more technical than that. But it's been stalled, this agreement. Sure. So what do we do about that at the WTO level?
No, you have to knock the heads of trade negotiators. I was a trade negotiator. I know full well how to never end a trade negotiation. I mean, and one of the reasons why this EGA thing, if the issue is your washing machine is brown and mine is green, so mine deserves a tariff reduction and yours deserves a tariff increase, mind you, the notion of what is a green and what is a brown washing machine among trade negotiators, not among experts of washing machines, among trade negotiators, can last a century. It's like the sex of angels. So you need a very big political determination at some stage. You need somebody that will say, okay, this is for washing machines, this is for bicycles, this is for toothbrush, and stop meddling the thing. And so far, this has not happened.
What about agricultural subsidies? There's this whole system of classifying them on whether they distort trade or not, and there's a suggestion in your paper that there might be an environmental and agricultural production value put into that. I mean, is that something that's feasible? Are we going to be able to knock the heads of the trade negotiators together on that one?
No, but in our paper we say we could invent something which is similar to the amber, blue, green box which exists in agriculture. By the way, not that this system has been very efficient, but it's been efficient enough for the US to stop negotiating the Doha round. So there must be something true in that. So it's just an analogy. And by the way, in the areas of subsidies, there is something much more urgent to be done, even than a very sort of inventive idea like this one, which is fossil fuels or fishery subsidies. These are areas where the capacity of WTO to to put together and to run a system of disciplines should be there. I mean, fossil subsidies is the number one issue we have to confront. The problem is that there's zero mandate in the WTO about that.
This morning we were having a discussion on the EU Mercosur agreement, and I listened to an interview that you did with French radio, and I think you said, this was back in July, before it had all of the problems in ratification in Austria and the issues with France and Ireland, that you thought that this agreement, because it ties Bolsonaro into the Paris Climate Change Agreement, would stop deforestation in the Amazon. We have a cattle rancher who may or may not be in the room, but he's certainly, hello John, who certainly knows what's happening in the Amazon. And I think he disagreed. I won't actually use the word that he said, but he disagreed.
I mean, let's see whether we agree or disagree. What I said at the time was that the Paris Agreement was a way to bring Bolsonaro and Brazil into the Paris tent and to enforce the Amazon, running the Amazon in a way compatible with the Paris Agreement, which is, and I believe this is the case. Now, of course, the other side of the coin is that if they don't comply, the Mercosur agreement will not work. So there is a higher conditionality than in other trade agreements. In the meantime, we've seen the consequences of the fact that apparently, and I'm not an expert of that, Brazil is not implementing its Paris Agreement, if not obligations, at least notification, which is why, in these conditions, I can tell you, no way the European Parliament will, in the next month or years, ratify a Mercosur agreement that does not take the deforestation problem seriously.
Just before I go to the audience, I have to ask you a Brexit question, because no discussion these days ever have to have something which is not on Brexit, but it's something that I think are worrying environmental NGOs in the UK, that if the UK does leave and it starts to rush for trade agreements, then environmental standards might not be included in those trade agreements. Is that a concern that you share?
No, because I don't think such agreement will pass muster in the House of Commons. If there's still a House of Commons, which so far
one can only hope that the parliamentarians do the right thing.
I mean, the British government, as far as I know, and you never know because they might have changed in the last 15 minutes, but so far, like other sort of reasonably modern democracies, trade agreements with the UK must go through the UK Parliament. And I don't think a minute, because Great Britain is part of the European civilization, I don't think 1 minute that such an agreement would go through the House of Commons. Mm. So they can threaten it. I mean, there is, and I understand, a fear. And by the way, one of the proposals we've done in this July paper was precisely to invent an EU post-Brexit UK, if and when it happens. That would be the best available benchmark on a environmentally compatible trade agreement. We have an occasion to do that between the EU and UK.
Well, I'm glad you've been doing it because I haven't seen much sign of progress in the UK. But let's hope they'll read your paper. I'd like to now go to the audience, and please, you can either use the app or you can just raise your hand, say who you are and what your question is to Pascal. As you can see, he can answer anything. Please, sir.
Hi, sorry. My name is Meroz. I work at ITC, and I have a question with regards to an agreement on environmental goods, and we have seen the negotiations went for a few years, EGA, and then we have a mandate in the Trade and Environment Committee since 1996, but there has not been a single agreement in that committee since then. And on the other hand, we saw an agreement in the Paris Agreement where there's an agreement to an end, but not to the means to the end. In that, and on the other hand, we see the developments in the market where in the last 2 years, the production of renewable energy is more cost effective than the fossil fuel subsidies. Looking at this, don't you think that the organizations, for instance, WTO and ITC, they must be promoting the use and showing the countries the means of how it is economically feasible or better for them, that they would shift their direction towards renewable energy rather than making them to put a carbon price or emission trading kind of system that we had in European Union?
Well, first, I think you need all of this. So you need to use the whole toolbox. We can have very interesting academic or policy discussions. The reality is that the problem is becoming so big, so urgent, that we have to address it with many, many of these instruments. Second, you're probably right that there is a need for a forum, for a table, for a place where you connect the various dots and the various bits and pieces of this. For reasons which I will not comment, the WTO has been reasonably shy to move in this direction in the name that it does not have a clear mandate from its members. And there are reasons why, if you put this on the table of the WTO, and if you ask for a mandate to start a forum, a negotiation, a discussion on this sort of thing, this will inevitably immediately be politicized. Many developing countries would suspect that this is the backdoor to green protectionism. The US will believe that it's one more reason to finger point them for the moment, and so on. So that's something which nevertheless should be considered. I mean, we should, in my view, we should have a sort of WTO UNEP sort of hub that where countries on this planet do come with proposals, discussions on something, sort of global, not only WTO Trade and Environment Committee, something that allows a discussion and allows people, notably in developing countries, who fear that once more this will work against them. We heard the Prime Minister of Barbados this morning. She's not very confident that this discussion is going to turn on the right side for her country. And she may be right. And there will be costly transitions. So I think we need something of this kind.
Thank you. Another question. Yes, please, sir.
Thank you, Pascal, for your presentation. It was so good to hear you. I'm Rodrigo Lima from Agroecon in Brazil. And there's a lot of talking about carbon and measuring carbon. There's a lot of methodologies and ways to do that. And I really feel threatened by the idea of targeting a product that's sustainable because it has low carbon content or low carbon emissions. How do you see sustainability in a broader picture considering agricultural products? We're going to have the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting in China next year, trying to agree new targets for biodiversity conservation. And agriculture relates totally with biodiversity also. So how do you see this picture of agricultural sustainable trade, considering different indicators beyond carbon? Carbon is one of them. Thank you.
No, I mean, I totally agree that agriculture-wise, carbon is one and only one of the issues. You have a big problem with biodiversity. You have a big problem with soil degeneration and regeneration, which is a major topic. So, fine with that. It remains that carbon emissions, or say greenhouse emissions, is still a big issue, including for cane growing, or beet growing, or cattle growing, and we've heard that this morning. And when you look at where there are carbon pricing systems, agriculture is not there in any place, because farmers have usually a political leverage that has allowed them to escape any sort of serious CO2 pricing. You've seen what happened in Europe. You've seen what happened in Australia, for instance. So this is a problem. But I totally agree with you that it's not the only problem. And I think that if we go the way of PPMs, if we go the way of traceability, and that's probably the way we will have to go in many of these areas, then the biodiversity impact or the soil impact of agricultural practices will have to come in. But if the notion is that sustainability is a wider issue than just carbon emissions, I totally agree with that. And if you look at what's happened in oceans, for instance, we know full well that the oceans are a big carbon sink, but that they are also one of the victims of the system.
Thank you very much. I'm very aware of time and that we do have another panel that's due to begin, but I would like to take one question, and let me take it from the lady in front. Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pascal. You've always been a big promoter of the environmental agenda in the WTO. Let me introduce myself. My name is Anja von Moltke. I work for UNEP. So I very much like the idea that you just put forward on a UNEP WTO hub, which is obviously not easy. And we've hosted joint high-level conferences with the WTO, but in order to really push the envelope, you have to bring the whole membership on board. So my question to you is, if you were still leading the WTO, what would you do right now, and how would you bring the membership on board on the most pressing environmental issues and on institutional collaboration? Thank you.
Well, you know, I never answer this sort of question.
It's a good question, though.
I never answer this sort of question. I've been for many years in my life in politics, and I've learned very early on that you always succeed in competent people, and you're always replaced by ungrateful people. So I know that, which is why I never answer this sort of question. But I think there is a need for a wider discussion. And you know, the last question we had from Brazil is a very good example. If you only focus on climate change, then people will say, you know, the French have nuclear energy, so they have a clean nose, and look at the rest. So this is something which I think really matters. Sustainability is a very wide issue. It has a huge impact on the way we produce and we consume. So I would, for instance, I would try and have a good G20 discussion about this. Not a G7 discussion. No, this is too easy. Or even a G8, although it probably would be a bit more difficult. But a G20 discussion. The G20 is not the government of this planet, but it's a place where you can introduce topics of this kind, and that, I think, would make a lot of sense. And if the WTO DG, the OECD SecGen, the UN SecGen, the World Bank President, and the IMF, if the five of them agree that something like this should happen at the G20, it could work.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for that positivity at the end of the conversation with myself and everybody in the audience. A round of applause, I think, is due.